The rain drummed against the windows of Marcello's, each droplet catching the warm amber light that spilled from the crystal chandeliers onto polished mahogany tables. The restaurant hummed with the quiet conversations of well-dressed couples, the gentle clink of silverware against fine china, and the soft notes of a piano drifting from the corner, where an elderly man played something melancholy and beautiful. Steam rose from cups of coffee and glasses of wine, creating a hazy, intimate atmosphere that seemed to wrap around each table like a whispered secret. It was the kind of place where proposals happened, where anniversaries were celebrated, where people came to mark the moments that mattered most. Tonight, however, it would become the setting for something far different, something that would test the very fabric of human kindness and reveal the depths of both cruelty and compassion that lived within strangers' hearts. Maya Anderson sat at table 12, her hands folded carefully in her lap, trying to steady the nervous flutter in her chest. She wore a deep emerald dress that brought out the warm brown of her eyes, her dark hair swept back in a simple but elegant style that had taken her an hour to perfect in front of her bedroom mirror. She had chosen this outfit with such care, standing before her closet for what felt like an eternity, discarding option after option, until she found something that made her feel beautiful, confident, worthy of being seen. The dress fit her perfectly, accentuating her curves in all the right places, but even as she sat in this beautiful restaurant surrounded by flickering candlelight, she could feel the familiar whisper of doubt creeping into her mind. Her fingers traced the edge of her napkin, a nervous habit she had developed over years of first dates that ended in polite excuses and phone numbers that were never called. This blind date had been arranged by her best friend Carmen, who had insisted with the relentless optimism of someone who had never struggled with her own reflection that Maya just needed to put herself out there more. "He's perfect for you," Carmen had said, practically glowing with excitement as she showed Maya the dating profile on her phone. "He's kind, he's successful, he loves to read, just like you do." And Maya, he specifically said he didn't care about appearances, that he was looking for someone with depth, someone real. Maya had wanted to believe it. She had allowed herself that dangerous luxury of hope, that maybe this time would be different, that maybe she had finally found someone who would see past the numbers on a scale, and the way her body didn't conform to the images that smiled back from magazine covers and movie screens. She glanced toward the entrance again, watching as couples entered together, their faces bright with laughter and anticipation. A young woman in a sleek black dress walked past her table, her heels clicking confidently against the tile floor, and Maya felt that familiar pang of comparison, that voice that whispered all the things she had spent years trying to silence. She forced herself to sit straighter, to remember the affirmations she had practiced in the mirror that morning. "You are worthy of love. You are beautiful exactly as you are. You deserve to be here." The words felt fragile in the face of her anxiety, but she held on to them like a lifeline, determined not to let fear rob her of this chance before it had even begun. The piano music shifted to something lighter, more hopeful, and Maya found herself smiling despite her nerves. The elderly pianist caught her eye and nodded, his fingers dancing across the keys with the grace of someone who had spent a lifetime making music for people who needed beauty in their lives. She thought about her own passion for literature, the way words could transport her to worlds where anything was possible, where heroines came in all shapes and sizes, and were loved for their courage, their wit, their kindness. Tonight, she told herself, she would be the heroine of her own story. She would be brave enough to let someone see her, really see her, and trust that what they found would be enough. At precisely 7:30, the door opened and a man stepped inside, shaking raindrops from his dark coat. Maya's breath caught as she recognized him from the photo Carmen had shown her. He was tall and lean, with carefully styled brown hair and sharp features that belonged on a magazine cover. He wore an expensive suit that fit him perfectly, and as he spoke to the hostess, Maya could see the easy confidence in his posture, the way he commanded attention without even trying. This was Thomas, her blind date, and for a moment she felt a flutter of something that might have been excitement, might have been terror. He looked exactly like the kind of man who had never noticed her in high school, who had walked past her in college hallways without a second glance, who had swiped left on dating apps before reading a single word of her carefully crafted profile. But Carmen had been so sure, so certain that Thomas was different. He had specifically requested to meet someone who valued intelligence over appearance, someone who could hold a real conversation about books and dreams and the things that mattered beyond the surface. Maya watched as the hostess led him through the restaurant, her heart hammering against her ribs as she prepared to stand and wave, to smile and introduce herself, to take this leap of faith that might just change everything. She smoothed her dress one final time, took a deep breath that tasted of hope and possibility, and prepared to meet her destiny. But as Thomas's gaze swept across the dining room and landed on her table, Maya saw something flicker across his face that made her blood run cold. It was just for an instant, so quick that she almost thought she had imagined it, but there was no mistaking the way his expression shifted from expectation to disappointment, from curiosity to something that looked uncomfortably like disgust. His steps slowed, then stopped altogether as he stood frozen in the middle of the restaurant, staring at her with the kind of expression she had hoped never to see again, the kind that made her feel like she was 12 years old and hiding in the bathroom during lunch, because the popular kids had made another joke about her appearance. The hostess turned back to him with a questioning look, and Maya saw Thomas shake his head slightly, then lean down to whisper something in her ear. The woman's eyes flicked toward Maya's table, and Maya felt her cheeks burn with a shame so intense it was physically painful. She wanted to disappear, to sink through the floor and emerge somewhere far away, where no one knew her name or her story, or the way she looked in this emerald dress that had made her feel so beautiful just moments before. But she remained frozen in her chair, watching in horror as Thomas turned on his heel and walked back toward the entrance, not bothering to look in her direction again, leaving her sitting alone at a table set for two, with the terrible knowledge that she had been judged and found wanting before they had even exchanged a single word. The hostess approached her table with an expression of professional sympathy that somehow made everything worse. "I'm sorry, miss, but your companion had to leave unexpectedly. He asked me to tell you that something urgent came up at work." The lie was delivered with practiced kindness, but Maya could see the pity in the woman's eyes, the uncomfortable awareness that they were both participants in a charade designed to save face. Maya nodded and managed a weak smile, her voice barely above a whisper, as she thanked the hostess and assured her that she understood, that these things happened, that she would be fine dining alone. But she wasn't fine. As the woman walked away and the normal sounds of the restaurant resumed around her, Maya felt something break inside her chest, something that had been cracked before but had never quite shattered completely. She reached for her water glass with trembling fingers, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to spill down her cheeks and ruin what was left of her carefully applied makeup. The piano music continued in the background, beautiful and mocking, and she found herself wondering how many other women had sat at this very table and felt their hearts break over appetizers they would never order, conversations they would never have, connections that would never be made because their bodies didn't fit the narrow definition of desirable that society had carved in stone. At a table not far away, Michael Thompson sat with his 8-year-old daughter Emma, watching the scene unfold with growing discomfort and anger. He had noticed the woman in the emerald dress when they first arrived, had seen the way she sat with such hopeful anticipation, the careful attention she had paid to her appearance, the nervous but genuine smile she had offered to passing servers. He had also seen the man who had walked in, looked at her, and left without a word, and the casual cruelty of it made something burn hot and fierce in his chest. Michael knew something about being judged unfairly, about having people make assumptions based on appearances or circumstances. As a single father who had been raising Emma alone since her mother died 3 years ago, he had endured his share of sideways looks and whispered comments from people who assumed he was doing something wrong, that a man couldn't possibly provide the kind of care a child needed. He had learned to ignore most of it, to focus on Emma's happiness and well-being rather than the opinions of strangers. But watching this woman's face crumple with hurt and humiliation, seeing the way she tried so hard to maintain her dignity in the face of such thoughtless cruelty, he found that he couldn't just sit by and do nothing. Emma had noticed the exchange too, her young face serious with the kind of moral clarity that children possess before the world taught them to look away from suffering. "Daddy," she whispered, tugging on his sleeve, "why did that man leave? The lady looks so sad." Michael looked down at his daughter, seeing the compassion in her white eyes, the instinctive understanding that something unfair had just happened to someone who didn't deserve it. He thought about the lessons he had been trying to teach her about kindness and standing up for others, about being the kind of person who made the world a little bit better rather than worse. Without giving himself time to second-guess the impulse, Michael stood up from his table and walked over to where Maya sat alone, her shoulders trembling slightly as she stared down at her hands. He cleared his throat gently, not wanting to startle her, and when she looked up with eyes that were bright with unshed tears, he felt his heart constrict with sympathy and a fierce protective instinct that surprised him with its intensity. "Excuse me," he said, his voice warm and carefully respectful. "I couldn't help but notice that you seem to be dining alone, and I was wondering if you might like some company. My daughter and I were just saying how nice it would be to meet someone new, and you look like exactly the kind of person we'd enjoy getting to know." Maya blinked up at him in surprise, her expression shifting from hurt to confusion to something that might have been hope. She glanced over at his table, where Emma was watching with bright, curious eyes, and Maya could see the genuine kindness in both their faces, the lack of pity or judgment that had been so painful in everyone else's reaction. Michael introduced himself and Emma, explaining that they were celebrating Emma's successful completion of a difficult school project, and that they would be honored if Maya would join them for dinner. There was nothing forced or artificial about his invitation, no sense that he was offering charity or trying to make himself feel better by performing a good deed. Instead, there was a simple recognition of her worth as a person, an acknowledgement that she deserved kindness and companionship, not because she needed rescuing, but because she was worthy of friendship. As Maya moved to their table and settled into the conversation that flowed as naturally as breathing, she found herself experiencing something she had never felt before, the sensation of being seen and valued exactly as she was. Michael didn't try to fill awkward silences with empty compliments about her appearance or reassurances that she was beautiful, despite what had happened. Instead, he asked about her work, her interests, her thoughts on the books she was reading, treating her like a complete person whose mind and personality were worthy of attention and respect. Emma, with the unfiltered honesty of childhood, declared that Maya had the prettiest smile she had ever seen, and that she wished her teacher was as nice as Maya seemed to be. The little girl's genuine warmth and acceptance, combined with her father's steady kindness, began to work something like magic on Maya's wounded spirit. For the first time in years, she found herself relaxing completely, laughing without self-consciousness, sharing stories and opinions without the constant mental monitoring of how she might be perceived. As their dinner progressed, Maya began to understand that Michael's kindness wasn't a response to her humiliation or an attempt to make up for Thomas's cruelty. It was simply who he was, the kind of man who noticed when someone was hurting and chose to offer comfort not because it made him look good, but because it was the right thing to do. She watched the gentle way he interacted with Emma, the patience in his voice when his daughter spilled sauce on her dress, the pride that lit up his face when she told Maya about her latest art project. This was a man who understood that strength came not from power or control, but from the willingness to be vulnerable, to care for others, to choose kindness even when it wasn't required or rewarded. When Emma excused herself to use the restroom, Michael turned to Maya with an expression that was serious, but not heavy, his eyes holding a warmth that made her feel safe enough to let down the last of her guard. "I want you to know," he said quietly, "that what happened earlier had nothing to do with you and everything to do with that man's inability to see what was right in front of him. You're intelligent, funny, kind, and genuinely interesting to talk to. Anyone who can't see that is missing out on something extraordinary, and their loss doesn't diminish your worth by even the smallest amount." Maya felt tears spring to her eyes again, but this time they were tears of gratitude and relief, rather than pain and humiliation. She had spent so many years believing that her value as a person was tied to her ability to meet other people's standards of physical attractiveness, that love and acceptance were contingent on fitting into a narrow mold that she would never be able to achieve. But sitting here with Michael and Emma, being treated with such genuine respect and affection, she began to understand that she had been measuring herself against the wrong standard all along. The conversation continued long after their plates were cleared, touching on everything from Emma's dreams of becoming a veterinarian to Michael's work as a pediatric nurse, from Maya's love of teaching literacy to adults who had missed educational opportunities to their shared appreciation for old movies and good books. There was an ease between them that Maya had never experienced with anyone before, a sense that she could be completely herself without fear of judgment or rejection. Michael laughed at her jokes, listened thoughtfully to her opinions, and included her in the gentle teasing that marked his relationship with Emma. As the evening wound toward its close, Maya realized that something fundamental had shifted inside her. The woman who had arrived at this restaurant seeking validation from a stranger was gone, replaced by someone who understood that her worth was not contingent on other people's approval. Michael's kindness had not rescued her from her insecurities. Instead, it had shown her that she was already whole, already valuable, already deserving of love and respect, exactly as she was. He had offered her the gift of seeing herself through the eyes of someone who valued character over appearance, depth over surface beauty, genuine connection over shallow attraction. When Michael asked if he could see her again, if perhaps she would like to join him and Emma for a picnic in the park the following weekend, Maya's yes came without hesitation or self-doubt. She had found something she hadn't even known she was looking for, not a romantic rescue or validation from a man, but a reflection of her own worth in the eyes of people who had the wisdom to see it. And as they exchanged phone numbers and made plans for their next meeting, Maya felt a confidence settling into her bones that she knew would never leave her again. 2 months later, Maya stood in front of her bathroom mirror, getting ready for another dinner at Marcello's. But this time, everything was different. The woman looking back at her held her shoulders straight, not because she was trying to project confidence she didn't feel, but because she genuinely liked the person she saw reflected there. She wore a burgundy dress that she had chosen because she loved the color, not because she thought it might hide or minimize anything about her body. Her hair fell in soft waves around her shoulders, and her makeup was applied with the care of someone who was enhancing features she had learned to appreciate, rather than trying to transform herself into someone else entirely. The past 2 months had been a revelation in ways she was still processing. Her friendship with Michael and Emma had deepened into something that brought joy and meaning to her everyday life in ways she had never imagined possible. They had spent countless hours together, exploring museums and parks, cooking dinner and helping Emma with homework, sharing quiet conversations after the little girl had gone to bed, and discovering that they had more in common than either of them had expected. Michael had never once made Maya feel like she was lucky to have his attention or that she should be grateful for his kindness. Instead, he consistently treated her like an equal partner in their growing relationship, someone whose thoughts and feelings and preferences mattered as much as his own. What had surprised Maya most was how natural it felt to be part of their little family unit. She had never seen herself as someone who would be comfortable around children, had always assumed that her awkwardness with her own body would translate into awkwardness with others. But Emma had accepted her with the wholehearted enthusiasm that children reserve for people they genuinely liked, and Maya had discovered reserves of patience and nurturing she hadn't known she possessed. Helping with homework, braiding hair before school, reading bedtime stories had all become sources of joy rather than obligation, ways of expressing love that felt as natural as breathing. The evening they were celebrating tonight marked a milestone that felt both significant and quietly profound. It had been exactly 2 months since that first dinner when Michael's simple act of kindness had changed the trajectory of Maya's life, and they had decided to return to the same restaurant to acknowledge how far they had all come. But more than that, Michael had hinted that he had something important to discuss with her. Something that had made Emma giggle with barely contained excitement whenever Maya tried to guess what it might be. As they settled into the same booth where they had first shared a meal, Maya felt a peace and contentment that had nothing to do with the romantic fantasies she had once entertained about what love should look like. This was better than anything she had imagined because it was real, built on a foundation of mutual respect and genuine affection, rather than the desperate need for validation that had driven so many of her previous relationships. Michael reached across the table to take her hand, his fingers warm and steady against hers, and she could see the future in his eyes, not as a rescue from her loneliness, but as a partnership between equals who had chosen each other with full knowledge and appreciation of who they really were. Emma bounced slightly in her seat, unable to contain her excitement any longer, and announced that her daddy had been practicing a speech for weeks, but that she was pretty sure Maya already knew what he was going to say, because love wasn't something you had to guess about when it was real. Michael laughed and admitted that his daughter was probably right, that the words he had planned seemed unnecessary when the feeling between them was so clear and strong. But he wanted to say them anyway, wanted Maya to know that what he felt for her was not gratitude for her kindness to Emma, or appreciation for the way she had fit so seamlessly into their lives, but love, in its truest and most honest form. "You changed everything for us," he said, his voice steady but full of emotion. "Not because you needed changing or because we needed someone to complete us, but because you brought something into our lives that we didn't even know we were missing. You brought yourself, exactly as you are, and that turned out to be exactly what we needed." Maya felt tears spring to her eyes as she listened to words that affirmed everything she had come to understand about her own worth, everything that Michael's consistent kindness had taught her about the nature of real love. When he pulled a small velvet box from his jacket pocket, Maya wasn't surprised so much as overwhelmed by the rightness of the moment, the way it felt like the natural culmination of everything they had been building together rather than a dramatic gesture designed to sweep her off her feet. The ring inside was simple and elegant, chosen with the same thoughtful care that Michael brought to everything in his life, and as he slipped it onto her finger, Maya felt the last of her old insecurities dissolve into something that felt like coming home. Emma threw her arms around both of them, declaring that she had known from the very first night that Maya was going to be her new mommy, and that she couldn't wait to tell everyone at school that her family was finally complete. As other diners turned to smile at their obvious joy and the elderly pianist played something that sounded like celebration, Maya realized that the love story she had found was better than any she had ever imagined, because it was based not on the fantasy of being transformed into someone else, but on the revolutionary idea that she was already enough, already worthy, already exactly who she was meant to be. The wedding took place 6 months later in the small garden behind Michael's house, surrounded by the people who had witnessed their journey and understood the significance of what they were celebrating. Maya wore a dress that made her feel beautiful, not because it hid anything about her body, but because it reflected the joy and confidence that now radiated from her like light. As she walked down the aisle scattered with Emma's carefully placed flower petals, she thought about the woman who had sat alone in that restaurant almost a year ago, convinced that her worth was tied to other people's approval and that love was something that happened to other people, people who looked different or lived different lives. That woman seemed like a stranger now, someone Maya remembered with compassion but could no longer relate to on any fundamental level. The transformation hadn't been about losing weight or changing her appearance or becoming someone different. It had been about learning to see herself through the eyes of people who valued her for who she really was. Michael's initial kindness had been the catalyst, but the real work of accepting and loving herself had been something she had done from the inside out, with his support and encouragement, but ultimately through her own growing understanding of her inherent worth. As they exchanged vows that promised not to complete each other, but to support each other's individual wholeness, Maya looked out at the small gathering of family and friends and felt the deep satisfaction of knowing that she was surrounded by people who saw and loved her exactly as she was. Emma stood beside them with the rings, practically vibrating with excitement as she took her role as flower girl and ring bearer seriously, and when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the little girl cheered louder than anyone else, declaring that this was the best day in the history of the world. Later, as they danced to music playing from a small speaker in the corner of the garden, Maya marveled at how different this love felt from anything she had ever imagined for herself. It was quieter than passion, steadier than romance, deeper than attraction. It was the love of two people who had chosen each other not because they needed to be saved or completed, but because they had recognized in each other the qualities that made life richer and more meaningful. It was love based on friendship, respect, shared values, and the simple pleasure of each other's company. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave with promises to visit soon, Maya found herself standing in the kitchen with Emma, washing dishes and talking about everything and nothing the way they had learned to do over the past months. The little girl looked up at her with serious eyes and said that she was glad her daddy had been brave enough to talk to Maya that first night, because it had changed everything for all of them in the best possible way. Maya agreed, understanding now that Michael's kindness had been the gift that allowed her to see herself clearly for the first time, to understand that she had always been worthy of love and simply needed to believe it herself. 3 years later, Maya stood in front of a room full of young women, sharing her story with the same quiet confidence that now characterized everything she did. She had been invited to speak at a conference about body positivity and self-acceptance, but her message went deeper than the typical rhetoric about loving yourself regardless of size. Instead, she talked about the difference between seeking validation and recognizing worth, about how real love could only enter your life when you stopped trying to earn it and started believing you deserved it exactly as you were. The audience listened with rapt attention as she described that night in the restaurant, the cruelty of Thomas's rejection, and the life-changing kindness of Michael's simple invitation to join his table. But she was careful to emphasize that Michael's kindness hadn't rescued her or given her worth. It had simply helped her see the worth that had always been there, waiting for her to acknowledge and embrace it. The real transformation had happened inside her own heart and mind, in the daily choice to treat herself with the same compassion and respect that she showed to others. After her talk, she was approached by dozens of women who wanted to share their own stories of rejection and self-doubt, who were hungry for practical advice about how to build the kind of unshakable confidence that Maya now possessed. She listened to each story with the patience and empathy that had become second nature to her, offering not empty platitudes but genuine understanding and practical suggestions for the hard work of learning to love yourself in a world that profited from your insecurity. The work had become more than a passion for Maya. It had become a calling. She had left her previous job to start a non-profit organization focused on helping women develop authentic self-confidence based on their inherent worth rather than their ability to meet external standards. The program combined practical workshops on communication and assertiveness with deeper work on identifying and challenging the negative beliefs that kept women trapped in cycles of self-doubt and people-pleasing. As she drove home that evening, Maya reflected on the strange and wonderful journey that had brought her to this place. The woman who had once sat alone in a restaurant, devastated by a stranger's rejection, now traveled the country helping other women understand that their worth was not contingent on anyone else's approval. She had found her voice not through achieving some impossible standard of perfection, but through the radical act of accepting herself exactly as she was and refusing to apologize for taking up space in the world. At home, Michael was helping Emma with a school project about heroes, and as Maya joined them at the kitchen table, she listened to her stepdaughter talk about the different kinds of courage it took to stand up for what was right. Emma had inherited her father's instinctive empathy and her stepmother's fierce sense of justice, and at 11 years old, she was already showing signs of becoming the kind of person who would make the world a little bit better wherever she went. Maya felt a deep pride in the young woman Emma was becoming, knowing that she was growing up in a household where her worth was never questioned and her voice was always heard. As they tucked Emma into bed and settled into their evening routine, Maya thought about how love had turned out to be nothing like what she had expected, and everything she had never known she needed. It wasn't the dramatic rescue or passionate romance she had once dreamed of. It was the quiet satisfaction of being known and valued, the daily choice to build a life based on mutual respect and shared values, the deep peace that came from being with someone who saw your flaws and loved you, not despite them, but as part of the complete package of who you were. That night, as she had every night for the past 3 years, Maya fell asleep feeling grateful not just for the love she had found, but for the journey that had brought her to it. The pain of that first rejection had been real and devastating, but it had also been the catalyst that forced her to examine her relationship with herself and ultimately led her to a deeper understanding of what love actually meant. Sometimes the worst moments in your life turned out to be the doorways to the best ones, not because the pain was somehow worth it, but because you learned to transform suffering into wisdom and heartbreak into healing. And in the quiet darkness of her bedroom, surrounded by the gentle breathing of her family, Maya knew that she would never again mistake someone else's inability to see her worth for evidence that she didn't have any. She was enough, had always been enough, and would continue to be enough for the rest of her days, not because someone else had finally noticed, but because she had finally learned to notice herself.